worry, the video is about to start in just a moment. I just want to mention a few things. You will notice on my channel there is going to be two versions of the Mandalorian. One is going to be time-lapse, where you can see the process from start to finish. And the other one is going to be an extended cut that includes me talking about the materials that I'm using and the tools and the techniques. It's also going to include the time-lapse part, because there are moments where I'm not talking, but the other parts where I'm actually explaining a bit about the tools that I'm using and all of that. Then the video is going to normal speed, but I know that some people would like to know a bit how I use some certain tools and that, and others just want to see the actual process being done. That's why I'm doing this for you. Two versions, and you will see in the video title, one is being called time-lapse and one is going to be called extended cut. But this intro is going to be in both of those videos. Yeah, but that's pretty much all I wanted to mention, so let's start the video. I just wanted to mention a few things before I start working on Mando. The most important thing that I want to mention, you maybe have noticed, but I have finally got professional studio lights so I can have this towards the object that I'm working on. You can see when I'm holding my hand like this, you can see just a tiny cast of a shadow. I can record whatever time of day with these lights, makes it this shade all the time. The details are much sharper, colors are showing up more accurate now. So hopefully this is going to improve the quality of upcoming videos. One thing I want to mention is the fact that I have bought these. They are pan pastels. The great thing about pan pastels is the fact that you can use them on background or undertone. If you're working on bigger areas that you want to fill in with colors, you don't need much because they are very opaque. They're not cheap. For me they were like $8, but since you only need to use so little, if you think about it, you're not going to waste money to have to buy more of these because they are going to last so long. Another thing I want to mention is the fact that the paper that I have here, it's not what I would recommend if you're working on a huge pastel painting. The surface here, yes, it's textured. Maybe 1 or 2 layers are going to stick to the surface. The recommended paper, pastel card, but pastel matte is the most popular. This is also Clairefontaine that also makes pastel matte. This one is called Paint On Multi-Techniques, which means you can use acrylics or watercolor. It says you can use pastels also, but it's very limited. You can't use that many layers. I have made this one. It's a portrait of our German Shepherd, Casper. I did record this video when I didn't have these studio lights, and this is also the same paper as the black one here. It's a gray shade. And I used pastels on this one. It still works. You just have to think about how you're going to apply your layers. So I don't know if this is going to work for everyone or if it depends on what kind of brand you're using, but I used fixative. I find it helps me if I'm going to work with a painting that has a lot of layers. So what I do is when I have applied the undertone, I go over just the dust of fixative on top of the surface. If you're using like pan pastels, I find that this helps the undertone layer stay in place, because pastels are like dusty, chalky finish. So if you can make them stay there, then it's easier to just paint sharper details on top of it. This is a test piece, so these are the shades in the background of the picture. I just used sponge applicator like this. Soft art sponge. These are made especially for using pan pastels. The only thing I had to do was just dip the sponge in the pan pastel, and all of this is just from tiny bit pan pastel. Sadly, I find that the lighter colors are a bit harder to get as vibrant, but I don't really mind that these shades look like this. The reference picture, they are a bit transparent. It's going to work for the effect that I'm going for, but I just wanted to show you that it's not going to be as vibrant on this particular paper. When I applied the pan pastels, I sprayed them with fixative. Pretty much no pastel coming off, because I wanted to test out what regular pastel pencils looks like after you apply the fixative. It works for this effect that I'm going for, so this is going to be good enough for me, especially when I'm painting the armor here, this chrome shade. So the amount of layers that I've got here should be enough. This is an alternative if you're going to work on something that isn't too high realism. And you can also see the outlines down here. These artistic details like the triangle here and some of the geometric symbols, they are actually inspired by another artist that makes beautiful pastel paintings of pet portraits. She has used some similar style, like using triangles. Sometimes she uses circles and makes the painting fade in from sketchy line art into realism. I just wanted to say that I'm not going to take any credit for this. I'm going to link to her channel in the description. I think she's more active on Instagram, but she has a few videos on YouTube, which made me so inspired to actually start working on pastels again. Take your time to look at her artwork. She's very, very talented. Yeah, that's pretty much all I was going to say. I think I've been talking too much now already, so I think you're anxious to watch me work on this painting, and so am I. If there is anything you want to know or want to ask, can just leave a comment, and I'm going to try my best to answer your questions. So I think it's time to start painting this guy. Quickly want to mention that I actually mix some of these shades on a piece of printer paper. That's what's great about pan pastels, is that you can easily mix the shade that you want. So what I do, I use this is also a soft tool, as these sponges. So I mix it on this paper here, and then I have the reference picture on my phone. Look, if I get a close match. I realized that I don't have, I needed something that was a bit more reddish. I only had orange here, because this gray tone here, I realized that it has a bit of a purple hue to it, and only gray and blue didn't give me the right shade. Thankfully, I have this beautiful burgundy that I have pressed into these tiny pans. They are not as pressed as these pan pastels, so they easily start to get all these dusty particles. So you have to be a bit careful. Mix it in with this bluish gray, and then I got this perfect purplish gray. I'm not creating a smooth background. I'm creating more of a pattern, so it doesn't look like smoke. It looks more like some kind of particle. Gives it a more interesting finish instead of just being just gradients from one color to another. So that's why I'm applying it more like dabbing motion. I thought it looked cool when I made a reference in Photoshop, so that's what I'm trying to recreate here. But I'm not going to do it exactly as the reference picture, because I was just doing something quickly in Photoshop just to get the idea. So I had sort of a vision about what I was going for, and now I have more free hand to do whatever I feel like. One thing you might notice is the fact that I try to make sure that I'm not going over the lines. It's not the end of the world if you just got a little bit of a shade of the background go over to the object that is in the foreground. Like I said before, this paper can only handle a few layers. I try to avoid getting too many layers on parts that I'm not working on right now, but since these are such thin layers of pan pastel, it's not going to affect the grain of the paper, but I still want to try to avoid getting any kind of color on those areas. And another thing you might notice is, even though the colors are looking very vibrant, you can still see the white traced outlines peeking through. Shows that the pan pastels aren't super opaque, but it still gives you a vibrant finish, which is perfect because I am going to reapply white paint on the outlines when I'm finished with the entire drawing. These geometric details, and also this is the way it says here. Now it looks a bit faded. So this paper definitely works for this kind of applications. Says I'm not using that much pastel. The tooth of the paper captures the particles of the pan pastel. Here it doesn't matter that I'm going over the line, because these parts are just line art which fades into the detailed parts. Here's just more like abstract lines. Since I want it to look like a continuous transition of the background, just adding the shades now. Looks more like it's a fluid motion, got a flow to it. Even for some reason it makes these white lines glow, which is actually a cool effect. If I look at the reference picture here, I notice that this part here is more of a spatter of particles instead of a smoky or clouded effect. I'm going to see if I can create this. Maybe I have to use a tiny sponge applicator. This looks like those makeup sponges. I think that one could be more suited for this. I think the soft tool is going to give it more of a softer effect, which is not what I'm going for. So I'm going to try and do it with this one. See if I can do it with the pan pastels and the pressed soft pastels. If it doesn't work, then I'm gonna skip that and just do it like a smoke effect, like I did with the rest. I think it might work. It's going to look cool no matter what. Sometimes I create things in Photoshop and think, well, that looks cool. And then I realize that, oh crap, I have to paint that now. It's like, oh, how am I gonna do that? So sometimes I have to do what's easiest to create with the tools that I have and create something that works better. But I might create something cool here. Obviously it's not going to be 100% like the reference picture. Don't really mind because I feel like artistic freedom here. This is just supposed to be more like a guide. It gives you an idea about what you're going for, and then you can just have that in mind, and then whatever works best for you to get a result that you're pleased with. I'm gonna try and find out what I can do here. It's sort of a artistic abstract style to it, so whatever flows naturally. I'm gonna start with a darker shade and then I'm gonna go over with a lighter shade. Yeah, that could work. It's not perfect in the reference picture either, so it's supposed to just give it a cool effect that is different from the rest of the background. I'm not going to do more here, but I know it's a lot more scatter here. That's very sharp. We'll see what I can do about that. Scatter here fades in to the cave. Goes from the scattered effect with all these cool artistic outlines, and then it just fades into the details. I'm gonna try and see if I can do it now. So I think that's going to be all the scatter details I'm going to do for now, because the other details that I have are more of a abstract style to them. They are much sharper, so I think the easiest way to get those details is if I use just regular pastel pencils. That's going to be the next step. I think I'm going to take a pause from pan pastels and soft pastels. I think I have already gotten all of those details that need to be blurry, and now it's time for all the sharper details that is in the background. Oh my god. I have to say, this is one of those moments where I start to question my decision. Why did I choose a picture that has so many colors? I've been just working on just a fourth of this helmet. Look, all these pencils for just this part. Just to make sure that I blend all these colors together to get the right shade. I think it's like 40 minutes. Oh dear. And I have to do all the rest of the armor too. Oh gosh. I mean, I am a person who likes to challenge myself. I love working on paintings with so many details, but sometimes I just want to ask myself, what were you thinking? Well, I got through so far. Starts to look like something. The camera never gives it justice, but in real life it looks very close to the reference that I'm working from. But yeah, it's gonna take a while. Just gonna keep going and finish this painting. I don't care how long it's gonna take. I will finish this painting. Alright, I'm gonna take a break now because I've been working on this helmet for 4 hours now. Oh dear. Well, I was expecting it to take a while, like I usually do, but I never expect it to take as long as it did. Since it's supposed to be chrome. In this picture it's not silver chrome because we have all of the other colors reflecting into the helmet, so that was a bit of a challenge. And after a while you get a bit blind when you're working so close up. You focus on all the tiny details. Like I said, you get blind so you can't even see the whole picture. I had to step back, and that's why I have zoomed out on the camera so you can see what the result looks like. So now I actually feel like all that time was worth it. But now I'm going to have to take a break from this painting. Continue with the rest of the armor later. Yeah, I think that's it. When I uploaded the previous video files to my computer, I noticed a pretty annoying thing. Hadn't noticed it before. So when I was editing the videos and wanted to add more contrast, I noticed that as soon as I put my hand here, everything else around it turned very dark and my hand was glowing up. Look at the settings on my camera, and it had actually a setting that was called auto brightness, which means that it would adjust the brightness on its own and it was focusing on something. I was able to turn that off and then adjust which brightness my painting would be when the lights are on. Now it's finally going to be this brightness, no matter how much I put my hand in front of it. Yeah, I'm gonna start working on the rest. This is how I create realism with pastels, I always start with the darkest shade that I can see in the parts I'm working on. In this part, the darkest shade is the black one. At first it might look very dark, but the thing about pastels is it's easier to blend all these colors if you are first applying a darker shade, and then you go over with brighter and brighter color, and then you finish with all the highlights. Then you can get these realistic shades and shadows. Sometimes I have to go over again with the darker shades, but then I blend again with brighter colors. This is the easiest way that I found, even though I'm working with so many colors. I feel that pastels really is all about the layers. So when you're working with realism, it isn't just one shade. All of these different shades together that creates this color that your eye first picks up. So even though you at first might think that something looks gray, turns out that it has a mixture of different shades, which are things that you only notice when you start to paint realism. If it's too bright, then I just go over with a darker shade, blending them in together. Because these pastels, they get this powdery finish that's easy to blend or erase. Because I'm not adding any pressure here, I'm just lightly going over the other layers that I have applied, and that's what helps me to get a smooth blend. Some bright highlights, because here it has this light source. And also when I have pieces that have very bright highlights, I try to avoid those areas with darker shade, because the brighter shade might blend in too much with the darker shades and it might be hard to get a bright highlight. Yeah, so this is the result so far. When I'm a bit further away from the drawing, it looks like some of these highlights are very bright. Here, here, and here. But if you look close up, you can see that the paper struggles a bit to capture all the details. So I have gone over with a dust of fixative to get these highlights, which obviously wouldn't happen if I had a paper that would actually be able to capture all of these layers. So I think maybe when the entire drawing is finished, I might go over some of these highlights with white ink and see if I can just brighten up a bit so it looks like a really shiny spot in all these chrome parts. Some areas like here and here and here, for some reason the highlights stay. Some areas, the parts that have all these very bright reflection, seem to have a little bit of a hard time to capture the color. But I don't really mind. It looks very close to the picture that I'm working from. I think I should rather focus on finishing all the rest, and then when that's finished I just go over with a dust layer of fixative. If I feel like the fixative have muted down the contrast, and I'll just go over with a little bit more of the darkest shadows and the brightest highlights. Alright, so I'm getting to the point where I started drawing when I was working on the scatter part of the background, and I was talking about how I was going to do this transition from the cape, going from all these details and then fade into this scatter part. I think I'm gonna try and start from the darkest and work up to the brightest. And also, since this cape is sort of a wool texture, that's why all of these highest, brightest details are more dotted instead of smooth color transitions. So I'm going to try and do that. Start from the black up to the darker blues and the green tones, and then go up to the brightest blues. I think I try and focus to keep all of these details here as realistic as possible, and then I do it less and less accurate further down that I get, so it looks more like a scattered effect. So I think I have to try and think of maybe something like this, just adding spots with a variety of colors of all these different shades that I'm going to use on the cape. I already have some scatter here, some are more faded, blurry, and others are sharper details. So it's definitely going to blend in with those. I focus more now on the actual cape I think this part here is going to be the realistic details, and then I just do it more sloppy, not focusing too much on adding the realism when I get further down, just add it more random. I want a smooth transition, and I don't want it to look like it's a break here, just from realism and just scatter, because then it's going to be too obvious. Do smaller and smaller random particles, get bigger and bigger, and it gets closer and closer to the cape. It's hard to see actually right now when I only applied the darker shades, but it's going to show up a lot more when I applied the brighter shades. So the darker tones are just for me to get the base applications down, and then the brighter details are going to bring it all together. This is a bit of a mid-tone blue. It's not dark and it's not too bright, but I'm applying it in more of a swirly motion or circle motions, however you want to say. And that helps me to bring this textured effect that this cape has. Try to not be as accurate to get it close to this line here. That gives more of the illusion of a scattered effect. So when I'm down here, I'm just going over with the pencil, a bit more harder pressure, so color shows up when I'm creating the scatter, adding smaller and smaller dots. And I just make bigger, sharper scatter, and then I just go back to adding this textured effect. And also it has these folds in the cape, so I had to create these shadows. So here it's supposed to be darker and here it's supposed to be brighter, because the cape is flowing in the wind. Very epic. Because not only is this cape flowing in the wind, we have all these scatters that's going the same direction as the cape. It's drawing more motion, something is happening. You may wonder why all the pictures that I could have chosen to draw of the Mandalorian, why I chose this one. When I'm talking now about motion in the picture, how it's a movement, something is happening, the flow. It's not stiff, it's not like it's just pasted onto the paper. It actually feels like it's alive in its own way, even though it's on a flat paper. I think this also the proportions of the fact that it's more like a diamond shape. Thins up here, goes wider here, and then it thins down here. And that's so cool when I'm combining it with all these geometric symbols. I think that's what's caught my eye. I'm very picky when it comes to what pictures I actually want to draw. I feel like if it's not interesting for my eyes, I feel like it's not going to reflect onto others, that others are going to feel the same way about the art that I'm creating. The scatter I'm adding right now, just with this mid-tone, it's adding so much already. You can see how it's fading into all the scatter details here. I might have to reapply the scatters here, make them brighter again, because I feel like maybe they have faded a bit during the time when I've been working. That's an easy fix. I can just go over again with a pencil if I feel like I have to, because you don't want to take the main focus away from here, the center. It's just supposed to be something interesting to catch the viewer's eye, but I don't want it to be too distracting. Well, notice after I've applied all the layers here of the colors, and I've brightened up some of the higher spots of the folds, then it's easier for me to see if I still feel like this part is too dark. Another thing that I love is the fact that, I don't know if it's called the same in English, but we call it complement colors, meaning if you look at the color wheel, you can see which color is the opposite to another. The opposite color of blues are often these orangey tones. For greens, it's more towards the reddish tones. Purple, it's yellow. And I find that here, the scatter on the outside and the color of the cape has more of these blue tones. The scatter here has more of these warm tones. And they're perfect since they are the opposite colors of each other. And also, it's what makes them stand out. So it's not like they're blending in too much. Like the eyes can't focus on anything. Because I find if this would have been like bright purple, yes, it would show up, but I feel like it would be too much cool tone next to each other. I think the eyes wouldn't really notice them as much, but now it actually has something. It's like candy for the eye, whichever place you're looking at. Also the fact that this side of the drawing has more of these warmer shades, and you can see all these red and yellow and orange tones fades into this green, and then it blends into these bluish tones. And then on this left side here we have all the warm tones on Mando, and the background has more of these cool tones. Makes the foreground pop a lot more. It gives it more depth, but it also makes the background stand out on its own, even though it's in the background. I don't know, stand out doesn't sound right, but it makes even the background interesting to look at instead of just being a boring, simple shade of a color in the background. It's like something is happening wherever you look at the drawing. So I think I should start with a brighter color. I'm just going to do this over and over again, the same process. I also like the fact that you can see the actual paper peeking through underneath the pastels, because that enhances the effect that this is starting to thin out here. It's a neat looking effect, but I'm not adding the colors close to the line here because that gives more of this effect that is losing all the details here and it's slowly just scattering. And you can even go over with some of the scatter on top of the parts that are supposed to be a bit more of the realism. It makes it look like scatter is starting, but it gets more intense further down. But I noticed in the reference picture it isn't too bright when it goes down here. It only has a highlight over here on the fibers, but further down it's more of a mid-tone blue. This brings out this illusion that it's a folded fabric, so I'm not adding any pressure. I don't want any intense highlight, I just want it a shade lighter. Yeah, I could even add some bright highlights on some of the edges on these particles, just random and not all the way around. It's like the scatter is catching some light. It also gives them a bit of a 3D, but not all of them. I don't want it to be too much. Sort of a layered effect of the scatters. Maybe a bit of a darker blue here. Still a mid-tone blue. It's a bit brighter than the other mid-tone blue that I used, because I think the light source is coming from here, but the folded fabric is bringing a shadow here, so the light doesn't catch the fabric as much on this part. So that's why it's a bit darker. Can also go with a black. This isn't a jet black. This one is called ivory black. I don't know, I find it funny because like ivory is supposed to be this cream white and black is black. They're supposed to be the complete opposite. But I guess you just call it ivory black because it's more of a dark grayish brown. Maybe sepia brown? But it's perfect for blending because it's a dark shade but it's not black. So if I don't want it too dark when I'm going to apply a shadow, I can use this one for blending out colors or add more depth and shadows. I think that's pretty much all I want to do with this scatter effect. Maybe a little bit of this light mint green. Yeah, that can work. And maybe a little bit here too. So I think that's pretty much the basic effect that I'm going for the rest of the cape. So I'm going to focus on the rest of the foreground now. I think I know which part you're most excited for me to start drawing. Me too. So I'm gonna start working on GROGU now, and I don't think there's going to be much of a difference of the actual application of how I work. I'm gonna start with the blacks, outline all the darkest parts and the shadows, and then go over with brighter and brighter colors because it's going to help me to blend everything. I want to make sure that I get the proportions right, the details right, like the application of his mouth and his eyes, make sure that they are in the right position. I also want to try to get as much of these tiny details as possible, even though it's a small area, small surface to work on. So I made sure that I prepared myself by sharpening all of these pencils that I've got, especially the black one and those pencils that are supposed to have these tinier highlighted details, which is going to be applied at the end of this process. These pencils, the Faber Castell, they are a bit harder, so they shouldn't break off that easily, especially now that I have sharpened them. So if I am a bit careful, they shouldn't break off that easily. But I want to make sure that I get the tiny details right. Thankfully, when you're working with these pastels, you can easily adjust mistakes by going over them, since the chalky finish of the pastels makes it easier to blend colors and reapply, change, brighten up, darken, which isn't the same if you're working with colored pencils that are more of a waxy finish. So I'm gonna try and see how this is going to turn out, because I see that these white lines, some of them are here, so they are a bit of a guide, but it's a bit hard for me to see where the actual placement is for the eyes. I know they're supposed to be here and here, but I need to make sure that I get the outlines right, because these lines are so thick. So I have to really take a close look at the reference picture and make sure that each step I'm applying the details right. I'm gonna take my time. I'm not gonna stress through this process, because then I know the finished result is not going to be something that I'm pleased with. This is a very important part of this whole drawing, and if I make this one look bad, I'm going to feel like the whole entire piece is going to be ruined. Yeah, it's a little bit nerve-wracking, but I'm gonna just relax, take my time, and I believe it's going to look great. So it's going to look great. Being optimistic here. I know this looks a bit dramatic right now, like the eyes look smaller and like he has some eyeliner, but it's just because the thickness of the black. But I'm going to go with a brighter shade on the inside of the eye, and that's going to make the iris bigger. I'm actually having the printed paper with all the outlines that I used when I traced all these white lines, so I can see much easily where I got these white lines from. So I know now that here is where the eye ends and begins, and here is supposed to be the lower eyelid. So I know that this is not supposed to be part of the eye, it's supposed to be up here. So it may look a bit crazy right now, but it's all about getting the base details down. And then I'm going to go over with other shades to get the realism. So I'm making sure that I get all these proportions right. Even like the placement of the eyes and the mouth looks right. So now I'm going over with the outlines of the face, trying to get the basic details of all the parts that are supposed to have shadows. They are obviously not black shadows, but I'm applying black as the base and then go over with other shades like I did on other parts. So it's going to be a bit dramatic at first, but then it's going to soften the more shades I apply. But now it's all about basic details here. So I think the best way for me to know that this eyes looks right is if I focus on adding the complete realism with all the shades and the highlights, so the iris and the pupils looks right. Then I'll know that the proportions and placement looks accurate. And then I'll focus on the rest of the face. So I'm using this dark brown to soften all these black details so the outlines doesn't look so thick and dramatic. So the irises looks like they are peeking through now. So I'm going over with brown first, and then I'm going over with what looks like a army green in the picture. And then I'll go back with the black to deepen the pupils and also get a white highlight to make sure that they look glossy like eyes. Can use a rice paper stump to remove some of the pastel, sharpen up the details a bit. I think those are the basic details of the eye. I will wait a minute before I add the white highlight. I think the easiest way for me now is to make sure that I'm applying all the shades and the rest of his face, because right now it might look like the eyes are brighter because I only have the black base of the paper, so the iris of his eyes might look brighter, but as soon as I apply his actual skin tones, the bluish green, then I think the eyes are going to be looking darker. So I think I'm gonna take a pause right now from the eyes. So I'm going to start working on the face now, and then I'm going to see what adjustments I want to do with the eyes. I can already see when I'm applying this dark brown that it looks like the eye on this side is starting to look more alive. It's not perfect yet, but just this little tiny detail added so much more when you look at the drawing. Realism is slowly peeking through and getting filled up. Add a bit of the dark green. I should actually start with the navy blue because that's when it's darker. I want to make sure that I do it in the right order from the darkest shade to the brighter shade. The eyes start to slowly look more and more alive. I know some of these shades here look a bit more dramatic and intense, but I'm going to use brighter colors later to soften them. It's easier if you get as much of the darker details down at first. It's hard to draw them as thin lines when you're working on a small surface. So I'd rather have them already down, and then I go over with the brighter shades. So it will soften and brighten up, but you still have these shadows in the background. And obviously if you go over with too much brighter details, you can always go back with the shadows. Now I'll go over with the green one, because green is one of the shades you can see the most. You have the green and then you have the turquoise, bright blue. Well, now focusing on adding an undertone layer of green, because that is going to help me blend in all these brighter greens and blues instead of just having the paper, because I find it harder to get a smooth blend and application with brighter shades if I don't have a darker base coat first, especially on this paper. Then I can lightly blend it in with these shades just to give them a hint of green. This is where it's good to know how to work in layers when you're working with colors. You can see which shade you're going for, and it's easier to know which shade is going to be the base coat. Sometimes you have to mix different shades. I can see that there are some bluish purples in some of the mid-tones. It's not the shadows and not the highlights, but some of the mid-tones has more of a bluish purple, and I have one here that's more of a bluish purple. I'm going to apply it very lightly. Here it's going to be very, very light blue. All of these parts here is going to look complete when I apply the brightest highlights here. So I know it looks very intense. It's not this green, obviously, in the finished result, but it's just so I have a base coat of green. And then I'll go over with the mid-tone blue. It's this one to make less green and more of a blue tint. Obviously I know the inside of the ears are going to be a glowing, almost neon pink, so I'm going to use a mixture of pink and bright orange, and hopefully that's going to give me the shade of pink that I can see in the reference. This is what I was talking about, why I'm starting out with the face, and then see if I need to do a few adjustments on the eyes. I feel that the ear should be a little bit higher. Yeah, it's starting to get closer now. So now it looks very rough. I feel the highlights are the parts that is going to make all things come together. So here I have this bluish purple. Still a bit too bright. Maybe this dark purple. So you can apply a brighter shade and then go over with a dark shade, blend it together to get a closer match. And here we have the finishing touches are going to be some bright highlights, are going to be the hair just reflecting in the light. I think I should start applying the details for the eyebrows, should be to get this more expression of his face to show through. So a lot of tiny details here, and try and make it as close as possible. I'm definitely going to have to take breaks between so I can go away and then come back, because then it's easier for me to see. Sometimes you get a bit blind, you can't see if you have applied something right, or if you think something looks wrong but you don't know why, then it's good to just take a couple of minutes of break, just walk away from the drawing and come back, and then you can see, alright, what do I need to change here? What is looking wrong for my eyes? Especially when you're working on something as tiny and as detailed as this, then it's definitely good to just take a little break. Right now the eyes might look a tiny bit dead because you don't have that glossy shine. Don't worry, I will add it. Gonna get these parts done first. You can see how I'm going back and forth here between the navy blue and the turquoise and some of the other mid-tone blues to enhance the fold here of the lower eyelid. Definitely I can see that these parts here, the highlights here, is going to get as bright as, I think it's white. So I think I can add the highlights here now. Just adding these tiny highlights. So I'm going to add some finishing touches here. We need some more brighter shades, brighter highlights. So I'm going back and forth between the white, and if the white is too bright, then I lightly go over with another shade just to mute down the white. Already those highlights look so alive. So even though it may not look at 100% like the reference, close enough, and it still gives the same effect. I felt like I needed to add those highlights in the eye so I can see how much more I need to actually add. I'm just gonna play around a bit more with all these highlights and shadows, and then I can move on to the next part of the drawing. So I gotta say that that's pretty much all I'm gonna do on his face. I'm pretty darn pleased with all the details I was able to get on this scale. I'm getting as close to the references as I can with the materials that I'm using. So I think I should move on to the next step and work on the rest of this part in his hand here. And then I can see if I want to go back and just adjust a little bit. Obviously I made it a little bit more dramatic with these white highlights, but I wanted to make a little bit my own take on this. Just have the reference as a guide, just get the basic details and proportions, and then just play around with the shades. Yeah, I'm super happy. So I think I should move on and focus on the rest of the drawing. And I think that's good enough. I zoomed out so you can see the finished result, because it's hard when you're so close up to actually see what the finished result looks like. And I'm super happy. So this entire part here is now finished. So I'm gonna take a break now, start with the rest of the lower body, and then the entire drawing will be done. If you're wondering, I am actually adding these details. Not accurate, just adding more like lines and some color applications on purpose, instead of creating a realistic look, making it look even more artistic than the reference that I'm working from. Because I want to enhance the fact that it looks like everything here is just slowly disintegrating into the scatter, so that's why I'm only applying these more like abstract line art now with all of these different colors. I'm trying to make it look like I have a smooth transition from realism up here, and down here it starts to just become more and more of these translucent details and just line art. So you know, it's just me doing this on purpose. So I'm gonna start working with the white ink. I'm gonna start with the text here. Says this is the way. I have my phone here as a guide, but I have these lines here also. But if the lines have faded, then I have the reference as a better guide for me to see. So these are pretty angled. So I'm going over the base guideline. This one is number C, so it has more of a angled tip, which I find is much better when you're working on these kind of details. You see that the lines are a bit thicker in the reference, but I'm gonna try first to sharpen up the contrast on these, and then if I want to make the lines thicker, then I'll just add more ink. And I try to take my time, because this is ink. It's not like the soft pastel where you can just brush it off or erase it. But it's alright if it's not perfect. And I noticed that this part here, the tip of the triangle, in the reference it's supposed to be filled in with white. But I think that it might be too much, so I will just redefine these lines and keep this triangle here blank, because I think too much white is going to be too distracting. So just focus on these symbols, text. I think it's from an alphabet, but I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, I can see in the viewfinder that this part is so bright now compared to the part that I haven't filled in yet, so this white ink really works. Hopefully it's going to work for these more abstract lines. I don't know if it's because of the paper or if it's the actual pen. Sometimes it doesn't want to get some ink out, so I have to brush back and forth until I get some white paint. And these symbols or letters, they might be a bit jagged because I have to lean my hand in a way so I don't smudge anything. It would be easier if I started from right to left, since I'm left-handed, but I think the ink dries pretty fast, so it shouldn't be a problem. So I'll start on the other side. I'm gonna see if I can try to work from the right to left. This is a part that has a lot of pastel, especially this part I think I have, as I went over the details to redefine the contrast. I haven't sprayed it with fixative because I don't want to risk it getting dark again, so I need to be careful that I do not smudge all of these highlights that I added. So when I want to make these lines thicker, I add one line first and then I add another line parallel to the other, and then I fill in the entire letter with ink. Maybe I have to go back and redefine a bit. It doesn't have to be perfect. Gives it a neat looking effect when it had these jagged lines. So this one is supposed to be, looks a bit like a knife or dagger. So it's supposed to be thin down here and widen up here. It's close enough. This is going to be a difficult angle to hold my hand. Try and see if I can add a paper. I'm gonna be careful not to move this paper because that can also smudge. I'm gonna try and work on this part. I'm actually standing when I'm working on this part because that's easier for me to have these angles on my hand. Yeah, it may not be perfect, but sure is a cool detail. Here you can see a few dots. And they're a bit faded. I hope this pen can paint. Sadly, I have another ink pen like this one, which is more like a brush tip. It's not like this angle tip. That one would have been perfect for details like this. Sadly, it was dried out. Let's see if it is too dry. Doesn't want to give me any color. I'm gonna try and see if this works. I have this Posca pen. Yeah, that works. If I dip this one in the Posca pen tip, this one seems to be able to pick up some of the ink. Because all I needed was to be able to write some dots. That works. But this one is definitely going to be too thick for these lines. So that's what I'm going to use this angled ink pen for. I'm going to see how much I can actually use the angled tip for. Then I'll try to do the technique with. This one is the Faber Castell B. The C is the angled one. And the B is the one that is just a straight up brush tip. I don't know if I'm going to use it for the parts, the line art that are, for example, around the cape. But I find that the triangle and the symbol here is supposed to look like this spear. I think that one is easier for me to use the angled one. Angles out at the tip so it can actually create these very thin lines, and I find that this one might work the best for these straight lines. They're actually supposed to be thick and then fade out to a thinner line. I'm gonna try and see if this can give me a steady hand when I'm going to create these sharp lines. And I also want to make sure that this is creating this faded effect. Thankfully, when I use the white tracing paper, these lines, they have stayed here much more than the other details. But I'm gonna try and take my time. Sometimes when you're using a ruler, ink can bleed underneath and can leave these uneven splotchy lines. I have to be careful and not do it too fast, because then maybe the ruler might slip. Yeah, that worked. So I didn't need to apply that much ink because I already had the white trace lines as a guide. But this one is just going to make sure that these lines stay bright. So I'm gonna remove any excess ink and the ruler so I won't accidentally do any marks on areas that I do not want any white ink. Seems to be dry, so it shouldn't be affecting anything if I just place the ruler here. So I realized that if I want the pen to actually start to paint with ink, I have to make sure that the brush tip is in, I think it's like a 45-degree angle. And you see I just flick it when I get further down, so I get more of this faded effect. So now it looks like it's brighter here and fades into nothing. So that's what I'm going to do in this inner line and on the other side. But it's going to be the same technique to make sure that I get these sharp, straight lines. So I'm blowing some air on the ink to make sure it dries much faster before I remove the ruler. Just want to make sure that I do not leave any marks or smudging or anything. But I feel like this ink actually dries so fast that I don't have to worry that much. Do this part, which is this spear that I added, because in the show, I think it was season 2, there was a spear that I think was made of Beskar metal. Can't remember, it was a while since I watched the show. I'm going to add this same technique like I did on the triangle, just one line here, but instead of fading here, it's supposed to break up a bit and then it's supposed to fade like that. This part I'm going to fill in. It's like a little diamond, and these parts are supposed to be tiny dots, so I'm obviously going to use the other ink pen and combine it with the Posca marker, and these dots are going this way and this way. It's just that this part has faded. Now I'm gonna try the same technique that I did earlier with my Faber Castell ink pen in this Posca marker. Make sure I get some white ink. These are most parts that are supposed to have straight lines and dots. So the rest of them are supposed to have these abstract lines. So I'm gonna try and see if I can do that with the Posca marker and the other ink pen. Definitely when I'm going to add it to the legs here, I feel like it's going to enhance the abstract style. I think I'm going to stick to this angled brush because the other one is going to add too thick of lines. The application may not be smooth, or I may not get thin lines like the reference has. If I want the ink to show up, I have to hold the pen in a certain angle, and that's what makes it a bit difficult to apply these lines. So I have to be a bit creative, so I'm doing it a bit different than the reference picture. The lines are going to be bit thicker, but I find that it actually is a good thing that they are a bit thicker because they are going to show up a lot more now. Instead of just having the lines fade out, I'm adding like tiny dots also to create a cool little detail there. I decided to add this one more sloppily or a bit jagged. Is it a cool effect? That's cool. Doing the same thing here. Now I'm going to work on these abstract lines that are on the cape and the scattering effect. It makes such a huge difference to get these lines because it really frames the cape here. It breaks up all of these different effects here. If I zoom out, you see it makes such a difference. The last part now is going to be the MUDHORN symbol. I realized that in the reference I had some lines that go up here. I think that is going to be too much for me to add. It's a bit too much. There's already so many things happening in this drawing that it's going to be too distracting. So it's a pretty large piece, so I think I'm going to have to do this in steps, meaning the recording. Let's start with this part here. So that's good enough. A bit uneven, crooked, jagged. There are some other parts that are like that too, and I feel like it's not going to take away the overall cool effect. I'm gonna try and see if I can get these lines a bit thinner, the ones that are here. So it was a bit hard to get these circles pretty even because the brush on this pen is so spread out, so I couldn't get a nice sharp crisp line. What I decided to do was, after I applied the ink, I just went over with the ivory black from earlier because it has the same shade as the paper, and then I just adjusted some of the parts. It bled out a bit, so now they look a bit sharper. From further away it looks more even now. And obviously we have the final step. And that wasn't even. This isn't going as planned, but I guess I just have to do whatever I can. Yeah, it's not my best signature because these pens doesn't want to cooperate, so I have to do something fancy here to make it look like it was applied like this on purpose. You know the feeling when you have finished a project that took a long time and you can't accept the fact that it's actually finished, and you just sit there and try to redefine tiny details, go over and over and over again. These are the moments when I have to tell myself that, Jen, it's okay, you're finished. Put the pencil down. Just accept the fact that drawing is complete. It's time to move on to the next project. Like I mentioned from the beginning, I was using materials that wasn't really recommended when you're working with pastels. So I'm happy that I was able to get this level of realism, but combining it with these kind of artistic abstract details, it makes it okay if you don't have 100% realism in the drawing. Then it looks more like you're going for an artistic finish instead of a hyper-realistic finish. It was still a bit of a challenge because you had to think a lot about how you're going to add your layers. And it was so many different effects that I had made in my reference picture that I didn't know if I was going to be able to create that, like the scatter, the details that I was very unsure about if I was going to be able to create those details. It was all of these white, cool symbols and lines, these details, and also these cool line art here. If I didn't have a ink pen that would work, then I would just accept the fact that I wasn't going to be able to get these bright details. But thankfully it worked, and it made such a huge difference to add these white effects. I felt like it took the drawing to a whole nother level. I'm super happy that I was able to get these chrome effects on the armor and some of these parts, highlights in the eyes, like it got this glossy effect. But I felt like this part here, before I added these white lines, it was looking like a bit of a blurry mess because you couldn't really see what it was supposed to represent. These parts was just lines and it was very messy. But as soon as I applied these lines, you could see that this is the part where the legs were, or the feet and calves, and they are just disintegrating into the scatter. So this is why I felt like the white ink really was the last part that I needed to make it complete. Makes the overall drawing so interesting to look at instead of just drawing Mando with a simple colored background, nothing else, just focusing on realism, which would have been cool also, but wouldn't have been unique, a bit original. But still, I was inspired by another artist, but I added my own final touches to it. But like I said, the triangle and some of this kind of line art and fade from realism to nothing, that was inspired by the other artists. But the fact that I made a scatter here and some of these other details like the MUDHORN and text here, those are obviously my own touches to it. So I took an inspiration from another artist and then I made my own version of it to make it still a bit more original or unique. But all I can say is that I'm super happy with the final result. I was so happy I was able to get to this level, all of these details. I was a bit nervous about drawing on this paper because I didn't know that I chose the wrong paper. Is this really the paper I should use for this project, or should I use this paper for a simpler project because of all the complex details and effects here? But sure works. It's not 100% recommended, but if you use some of the techniques that I did, it's still going to be making it a bit more complicated because you have to work in layers and spray it with fixative from time to time to make sure that the pastel stays there, which is something you wouldn't have to do if you used a paper that was actually meant for these materials. But for the materials that I have, I couldn't be more pleased with the final result. So this is sure going to be a very cool drawing to hang on my wall. Hard to believe that I'm actually finished with this project, but I guess it's time to start working on a new project. So, see you in the next one.